All right, this is Jeremy Roth-Kushel and Greg McCarran here with the Antidote Deepcore text. We wanted, in light of the current moment, the escalatory violence going on disproportionately against Palestinians in Gaza, but affecting civilians of quote-unquote both sides of the quote-unquote so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to go back a little bit and read a very interesting, short, but very crisp and to the point article written by Malcolm X, 1964, published September 17th, 1964, in the Egyptian Gazette, titled Zionist Logic. And he goes through a bunch of different points. And so we want to read through this, and we are open to discussing as we go along here. And if anybody joins us and wants to join us and talk about any of these points, we will bring you on stage and can raise your hand.
Indeed. Thanks for being part of this. And yeah, definitely. Let's get into what we're going to get into here. Zionist Logic by Malcolm X. As you said, I think it is a useful article for the time period when everything's just gone down in terms of the most recent escalation and the most recent acts of war carried out by the Zionist state against the Palestinian population. And of course, somebody like Malcolm X, who was in many cases 60 years ahead of I think a lot of people, with the sea change and shift in terms of thinking, in terms of at some points in our history, more taboo over time topic of Israel, Zionism, etc., becoming less of a taboo topic and more critical discussion, discourse being had on it. It is interesting, I think, with the sea change that is really, I think, starting to take place, in American politics, I'm sure in the West in general, but here in our country with this, with the most recent chain of events, of course, coinciding with the last several years of all things related to Trump and Netanyahu and this foreign acts, global trend that's been going on in terms of the move towards autocracy and all of that. And so I think as we'll point out as we go along through this article, it is very so it's interesting just how insightful this was in the early 60s, and then you could see over time the basic truths I think remain, and in this time period it's great to bring an article like this back. So
yes. All right, and we will, maybe not necessarily on Clubhouse, but maybe we'll do some replays and discussions on Clubhouse when we get into some text. But we will, on our Antidote long form podcast, discuss the more specific events, geopolitics, political motivations, some of the deep background of this escalatory moment. And discuss the question of occupied East Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah, the questions of Netanyahu trying to flee forward in many ways in terms of being indicted around corruption. He's obviously a global mob boss, and he's not exactly who he is presented to be necessarily, especially in relationship to even some of the Palestinian solidarity activists, especially from maybe left liberal Zionist circles in the United States of America. And there's all kinds of limitations and limited hangouts in terms of both of what Malcolm X lays bare in terms of the Zionist logic and the historical dimensions of all of this, but also the nature of the background of the terror state itself, and the fact that it was not only forged in terrorism, it's also maintained in terrorism. And if there's any singular figure of the 21st century who is the arch terrorist of the globe, it's hard to pick someone else other than the current prime minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. And we will, in future Antidote Deepcore texts, read from the book State of Terror by Thomas Suarez, which is, let me see here. the subtitle is How Terrorism Created Modern Israel. And then what we would add to it is how terrorism maintains 21st century Israel. And we'll make the point, I think, that this was escalated very specifically by Netanyahu, but it didn't only benefit him. It does also benefit the so-called Palestinian leadership in many ways. And the Palestinian streets have always been very clear that they've had a moral and political consensus for a long, long time before even the state of Israel was created itself, in terms of the real aspirations, the legitimate Jewish, indigenous, and religious aspirations in relationship to a potential return to a homeland in Palestine, and in ancient Judea, surrounding that is a whole separate thing than what actually the Zionist project is. And the Palestinians, the consensus, I would call it, of the authentic Palestinian street and the commanding heights of the Palestinian intellectuals, they have always, it's this whole thing about, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The way that it's maligned in the Zionist press is that it's some kind of genocidal drive the Jews into the sea kind of scenario. It's never been that. It's always been actually way before its time in many ways, a call for democracy and political and ethnic and religious ecumenicalism, really, in many ways. And so there's a whole nother aspect going on here in terms of the deep politics that maintain, under the guise of some of these talking points about the Jewish right to return, which there is something there. But as I've been describing it to certain Zionist rooms over the last week on Clubhouse, that's fine, and I would also love to go visit the ancient Jewish homelands someday, but I'm not gonna do it under the sponsorship of the terrorist originated and terrorist maintained Zionist occupation. That's not a moral Jewish project. So, and I would just, the parallel I've been drawing is that no matter the question of the indigenousness, obviously, there's been groups of Jews that have always lived in that area. Some have gone to other parts of the world, either been driven out, chose to make moves, and so the question of the genetic connection, I think, is besides the point in many ways in terms of the political legitimacy and morality, because it would just take it to the current American moment, like if indigenous tribes in the United States, the Native Americans who are also subjected to genocide, maybe a more severe form of genocide in certain ways in terms of the amount of total death, but a similar kind of genocide in certain ways in terms of this question of reservations to the current moment that are obviously second class in terms of opportunity and the economic existence. But let's just say that there was a movement, a political movement of indigenous Americans in the mid 20th century. Let's say it was the native tribe that has been alleged to have sold, or some way the property was transferred over to the Dutch settlers in Manhattoes. And they came back in 1945 and said, we have a right to this land. We have both an ancient ethnic relationship. It wouldn't be as ancient. Actually, it would be much more recent in certain ways than the question of the ancient Jewish homelands in terms of modern day Palestine. But they'd say, okay, we're coming back to this Manhattan, this little bit of land down here, and we have both a direct ethnic relationship to this land, and we have a spiritual relationship to this land. And we're going to come in here, or we're going to start blowing up buildings, and we're going to start poisoning the water supply, and we're going to drive all of the non-indigenous people out, and we're going to seize their homes, and we're going to keep them. They can live in New Jersey, they can live in Newark, and under constant surveillance. And maybe some of them can be let out. Maybe those in Newark can be let out. But those in Camden cannot leave. It would be obvious that it was not a legitimate political movement, and it would be put down as such. And so that is the reality of the situation in terms of the question of legitimacy that is used, I think, in many ways to try to actually avoid the question of modern day terrorism and war and the kind of not even that far behind the scenes machinations that we've been covering in the Antidote Deepcore text clubhouse rooms relating to things like the Israel Lobby, Chapter 8, Mearsheimer and Walt pointing out very obviously that the Israel Lobby was the dominant factor in the direction of the Iraq war in 2003. Very obvious. It's very, very, very plain to see. And it was the totality of the Israel Lobby. It was not just the Likud lobby or the right wing. No, the liberal Zionists were all part of it, and we're all down for it. And that's what showed it that it was actually a project of the Israel Lobby and not just some kind of Likud operation. But meanwhile, the Likudist Netanyahu, he did lead the way on that. He was the one who came to Congress, who was, quote unquote, chosen to come to Congress to be the one to push for the necessary reason for the United States to invade Iraq. And I believe Greg, that was in 2002, fall of 2002. Netanyahu is agitating for aggressive illegal war based on deception in Iraq in front of Congress in the fall of 2002.
So, yeah, just treating Congress like he's in control, similar to what he did a decade later when he was brought over to speak to a joint session of Congress, basically to embarrass and humiliate and make the then President Barack Obama look terrible while pretty much usurping American, attempting to usurp American influence and policy making. So yeah, it's a long history with Netanyahu of coming over to America and basically acting like, as Bill Clinton once said, I thought we were the superpower here in relation to Benjamin Netanyahu back in the 90s.
So there's that. There's the question of war, and in the 21st century in the United States, that the Israel Lobby was crucial to this most obviously wrong and illegal and immoral war of the war in Iraq. But there's also terrorism, and I believe that it has to be seen that there's somewhere in between the question of treason and terrorism in relationship to Netanyahu's motivations in escalating this situation. He basically obviously was he was a day away, it looked like, from a potential political opposition coalition forming, centered around Lapid, and who, at the very least, of course, Zionist logic is Zionist logic when it comes down to it. But what Lapid actually was saying in relationship to the domestic aspects of the marauding Israeli Jews who were shouting death to Arabs and basically doing in the street pogroms and what was going on in East Jerusalem, and then the capstone event of the escalation at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and where what I've heard some of the Zionist spokespeople, including the Israeli consul of Southeast, either in the United States. I was in a room with him, and he seemed to be pointing out the political motivations of both Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, and also Hamas in all this. And I can't say that that's wrong. That's actually partially true, and that Abbas, the PA has been historically corrupt. Abbas was very happy to avoid calling the elections. It's very possible Hamas was going to win. Hamas is very happy to put some of their new next generation missiles to test, flex themselves a little bit. They seem to be getting both mainly know-how, but potentially also materials in terms of the construction of these next generation rockets, which are more effective and more powerful, which is why they're able to actually strike a little bit more inside of Israel and break past the Iron Dome a little bit, is because they have this a pretty strong support from Iran at this point. So there's all of these factors of all these political players who are benefiting, and yet, of course, the Israeli consul is going to leave out the main architect, the main beneficiary of the current moment, which is Benjamin Netanyahu himself. And the last thing I'll say in terms of the political motivation is that Sarah Netanyahu said in 2002, when Netanyahu was running for re-election, and remember, Netanyahu was brought in 1996 to prime minister under the political operations and tutelage of Arthur Finkelstein, who is the key American political dirty trickster guru who spawned a whole next generation of Finky's kids, people such as the Roger Stones, who we know about, or John, what's his name? John,
you're thinking of John McLaughlin.
John McLaughlin, thank you, the quote-unquote pollster who went directly out of working with Netanyahu to work for the Trump campaign in 2016, or even Frank Luntz.
Yeah, yes, Frank Luntz, and of course, Frank Luntz linking back to the Epstein-Wexner network with his Iraq War analysis study group. And one more name I was going to mention.
Fill that in. Will you fill that in real quick, and then get back to Arthur Finkelstein, the study group?
Yeah, so basically, Frank Luntz, who was like a manipulative, PR guru, quote unquote guru. He's the guy who does these focus groups for outlets such as Fox News, where, get the pulse of what the people who go to like events or who are considering, it's very manipulative, but it's very effective in terms of like, Frank, if you've ever seen like any of like his focus groups that he does. And, in early 2003, I believe about a month or so after the Iraq War began, it was, Frank Luntz carried out on behalf of, basically, in the name of Leslie Wexner, carried out this analysis on the Iraq War, and actually, it was done
basically how to sell it, right?
The bigger Wexner group, which of course has come out of Frank Luntz's connections to Kevin McCarthy and linking into Wexner, and so Jeremy, can you fill in a little more on this? I'm almost I don't know what's going on. I'm not forgetting the exact circumstances of everything that the Luntz-Wexner analysis entailed, but basically it was a propaganda.
They were trying to sell it. They were
study group that was done in terms of increasing like support for the American war effort in Iraq, and it was done on behalf of this very Zionist-centric Wexner.
Yes, exactly. They were trying to sell the recently born Iraq war as not good for Israel, but in American interests, is the epicenter of it. And it was the Wexner and his group who sponsored Luntz to go ahead and do the Iraq analysis. And then it was eventually leaked.
Exactly. And it was under the guise of like representing American interests, but coming straight out of the heart of like this, the heart of Zionist power in America, in terms of like some of the most hardline, some of the deepest, most entrenched pro-Zionist, not just pro-Israel, but particularly hardline Zionist mindset philosophy that was carrying out and conducting this on behalf of, under the guise of representing American interests, when in actuality it's being done by the epitome of the same mindset that was at the heart of pushing for the actual intervention in the Iraq War. So it's being done under the guise of like just simply an American-centric study of why this is good, and it's when in reality it's just another function of this deeper network, both of like this entrenched American Zionist power, but then also leading back, of course, and then you have taken the Wexner-Epstein relationship in the area of compromise, around political compromise, as well around political figures, business figures, etc. So this was that was and by the way, Luntz, once again going back to this Arthur Finkelstein network that you brought up before.
Yeah, and you wanted to bring up some other members of the Finkelstein
one
network.
name I was going to bring up that Arthur Finkelstein played a major role in the rise of was, I would guess you could say, one of the political prototypes for Donald Trump and what we know as MAGA, and that was Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina. Senator Jesse Helms, the ultra-right, I say in many ways like a prototype for Donald Trump, like as far as his domestic policy and the basically being like the new version of like the post-civil rights, post-Jim Crow Southerner in Jesse Helms from North Carolina. And you can go look at Jesse Helms' career and some of the policies he was behind, and in a lot of ways, I would say Jesse Helms was one of the prototypes for MAGA and for Trump. So if you see getting into this moment, it was you have Arthur Finkelstein, who went on to play a major role in the rise of Benjamin Netanyahu. His network is all over Donald Trump, as far as the John McLaughlins of the world, the Roger Stones of the world, and then Finkelstein being key to the political rise of Jesse Helms, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, who back in the 70s, 80s, 90s was in many ways made a prototype for the modern Trumpist MAGA American politicians. So,
thank you. And so those important origins of Netanyahu's long career in terms of the office of the Prime Minister of Israel was facilitated by Arthur Finkelstein's network, Arthur Finkelstein himself, and then Arthur Finkelstein himself, and then his network are the key ones, like you said, who then go ahead and facilitate Trump in 2015, 2016, and then throughout the years. And then so this other question that you brought up in terms of Wexner's interests and Wexner's network. On one side, you have this very strong funding and backing of just hardcore propaganda, quote unquote, public relations, framing, all these quote unquote pollsters like Luntz, who it's basically polling in this frame is usually brought up as if it were trying to get the pulse of the people, but it's actually a framing and a sourcing of hardcore propaganda is the way that it's actually used. And so there's that aspect of it, and you would have to include then other assets, intellectual assets of the Wexner network, as people like Deborah Lipstadt, who is the dean of the new anti-Semitism studies in the public sphere at this point, and that is heavily drawn in relationship to trying to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And you can then draw some of that back to someone like Natan Sharansky, as we pointed out before, who's a very interesting character, who is the modern godfather of the new anti-Semitism and wrote both the book on that and the book on the Iraq War and the general Middle East program of George W. Bush as being driven by a quote-unquote democracy project. So there's a whole background there that we've covered on The Antidote multiple times, and we will continue into the future. But I just wanted to point out that not only do you have this Luntz propaganda aspect, but you also have this Deborah Lipstadt propaganda aspect in terms of the new anti-Semitism. And Lipstadt has been backed and funded and prized by the Wexner Network and the Wexner Foundation, I believe, for many, 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 many years. And so there's that whole pillar of their operations. But the other pillar is what you mentioned too, the link, the tie-in, the sponsorship, really, the domestic sponsorship in an American context of the Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell compromise operation based on pedophilic, sex trafficking and audio-visual compromise evidence that's then held over people's heads, really. And that includes these kinds of relationships, as we pointed out, included the two most intimately connected to this Epstein-Maxwell compromat network, tied into basically the patron of which is Wexner himself, were our two candidates put forth to us in 2016. The Clintons, Hillary Clinton herself, but also Bill Clinton. The Epstein was apparently intimately involved in the generation of the Clinton Foundation. Clinton would visit Epstein's Wexner-supplied most expensive brownstone in the entire Manhattan area while he was president. Clinton would, under protection of Secret Service apparently, roll up to Epstein's quote-unquote parties at Wexner's, the Wexner supplied brownstone while Clinton was president. Okay. So there's that whole dynamic there. And of course, Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein were good buds going way back, and were, mutually accused by people like Katie Johnson, who was a young teenager, maybe not even a teen, maybe she was 12 actually. Was she 12, I think, when she alleges?
I believe she was 13.
All right, so she was in her first teen year when she alleges that she was raped in an Epstein brownstone by Donald Trump and Epstein himself. And that then got wiped away, and the whole MAGA set said it was just totally made up. But meanwhile,
complete media blackout. I mean, you even had someone as prominent as Chris Cuomo of CNN in a tweet just before the 2016 election, responding to somebody asking about the case. We're not going to report on unsubstantiated or unverifiable allegations against presidential candidates. I mean, just about a complete media blackout, which makes you wonder, with all of the perceived opposition to Trump and hostility to Trump and by the entire media establishment, just about as close to complete silence on this matter as you could possibly get, even still now to this day, even after the aftermath of the 2020 election, and after hundreds of thousands of people dying because of the best incompetence and at worst outright malicious response to the COVID pandemic, yet still just about complete silence to this day. And then, of course, that also raises the question of what led to the retraction just days before the election. That is another conversation for another time. We have to look at the potential of were there threats to silence this person? But but in general, just the silence, just the media radio silence on this case, even in terms of even critical reporting one way or the other, trying to prove it, trying to verify it, trying to unverify it, see whether it's just, I mean, it's not a surprise, but it's still kind of amazing when you consider all things.
Yes, and bringing this preamble to a close, and then we'll start reading through Zionist Logic by Malcolm X, published in the Egyptian Gazette, September 17, 1964. It should also be pointed out in relationship to compromat that we really want to begin to introduce a conceptualization of compromat that really goes beyond the individual or the individuals or even the network, but even begins to operate at the level of the state or international relations. They're transnational compromat, interstitial compromat that's also intergenerationally maintained. Especially when you look at something like the Maxwell network, the father, Ghislaine's father, Robert, sits at the epicenter of a transnational compromat network that appears to be involved in compromising the highest levels of nation state, security state apparati, including the United States, including potentially even Israel itself. We'll begin to look into that, but also then towards the East and the then Soviet Union and now into Russia. And so that's the sort of final little point I'd like to make, the hinting at what we want to begin to cover in terms of the possibility that Israel itself begins to look more and more like a compromat operation itself, especially in relationship to the United States. Coming out of the Cold War, and it as seen as an asset by the United States in the Cold War, and this clip that's making all of the progressive and left rounds in terms of Joe Biden in the 80s, I think, talking about how Israel is the greatest $3 billion asset, $3 billion investment a year that the United States can make, and that if Israel didn't exist, the United States would have to invent it. And so there's obviously was something to that in terms of, especially in relationship to the Cold War. But as we begin to see that there was a back door, there was a poison pill to it, there was a compromat operation that appears to be running in the background in relationship to that, the special relationship, the U.S. and Israel, where you begin to see the escalation of Israeli involvement in partnership with some of the highest corrupt elements of the covert operatives in the United States in terms of things like the assassinations of the 60s, most obviously the President of the United States, John Kennedy. And there's all kinds of dynamics there that go beyond that, but we'll touch back on that later. But then would it include then the fact that these crucial African American leaders like King and X were also assassinated in those years? And we do know now, based on the testimony of a former Anti-Defamation League employee, that the ADL was spying on King because of a wariness of his turn towards Palestinian solidarity. All right. And so this is the background of this relationship. And more, it looks related to that Israel itself is potentially can be seen as a false flag ally, a false flag friend. And as I heard, and we'll pursue this again in the future, I heard on Clubhouse from a very sharp and plain-spoken Palestinian woman when someone was pushing the Palestinians and people in Palestinian solidarity rooms on Clubhouse to use Telegram as a secure mode of communication as opposed to WhatsApp, for example. And of course, there's this whole NSO group, compromise, Israeli military intelligence, cyber compromise of WhatsApp going through the courts, and even the deputy director of the Justice Department, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, former, is their counsel. But there is also this question of Telegram. And so this Palestinian woman basically said we should use Telegram because it was created by Russia. And they don't have any of these kinds of negative surveillance interests that others, such as the owners of WhatsApp, might in the West. And then very, very plainly and clearly, a Palestinian woman says, I would warn people against assuming that Telegram is safe. And she said, in fact, I would say you should not use it. All of us, we know that Israel is Russia's Silicon Valley in the Middle East. And so that's the final point, that there is this very strange dynamic that goes on with these specific leaders that seem to really use these provocations in relationship to Jerusalem specifically, Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, people like Ariel Sharon, who was notoriously known as Moscow's secret weapon, who would do these kinds of mass provocations. And now you see Netanyahu, and everybody is beginning to realize how close Netanyahu and Putin are. Okay, so it wasn't just Trump, it's also Netanyahu. And if there were two foreign leaders who were most intimately interested and, I might assert, involved in facilitating the rise of Trump in the United States politically as president, it would be Putin and Netanyahu. And the one that's left out of it in most, polite public conversations is Netanyahu. In fact, when I brought it up in a clubhouse room with a former Israeli defense, quote unquote, defense forces photographer, who's now a documentary guy, apparently is alleged to be progressive in the United States. He called it a vicious conspiracy theory that Netanyahu was involved with Putin in facilitating the political rise of Trump in 2016. So I would just say, to me, that whole piece there needs to be focused on. It's obviously it's a hot button issue, and it's being sat upon in the United States, especially I would say in the left. There's not only a cover up in certain pockets of the left around Trump Russia. Obviously, the sort of whole MAGA right is totally gone on any of that. That includes Trump Russia, but that also in many pockets includes the alt-right, let's say. It very much includes Trump Israel and Trump Netanyahu. But this is an Achilles heel, I think, of the sordid Zionist Logic project, which is this question of why is it that this alleged ally, Israel, and its apparent, its alleged leader Netanyahu is so close with our alleged greatest nemesis, or one of our greatest nemesis, China and Russia, and so that is a key point. And so we'll be going into more on that later on. But just one last point about this Temple Mount thing and these deep machinations here. There's a figure named Stanley Goldfoot, who was in the Stern Gang and was reported to have played a leading role in blowing up the King David Hotel in the late 1940s to bring in really sort of as the key geopolitical moment, and also the birth of modern terrorism in many ways. And of course, they considered it a legitimate military target, just as Zionist Logic in this last week considered the apartment buildings of Palestinians in an open air prison such as Gaza. There's life going on there, but you're stuck at some level. So it's a prison of some sort. But that only that similar kind of Zionist logic would consider the King David Hotel bombing, which by the way, not putting Jewish life over other human life, but I'm just saying in the Zionist context of this is a state that's meant to, this is a movement that's meant to prioritize the safety and the dignity and the flourishing of Jewish life, also then sacrifice a Jewish life in the King David Hotel bombing as a quote-unquote legitimate target, just like they sacrifice Palestinian lives in dozens of children and dozens of innocent, totally non-involved people, unless you can say that just being in a place or maybe voting makes you guilty enough to be targeted by one of the most powerful militaries in the world for death and destruction. That's not even to mention the press in the building, AP and Al Jazeera, and what that all means. And then, of course, this is what I said before, that there's an aspect of treason to this, that Netanyahu knew. He knew exactly how this was all going to go down. They were going to do provoke response at Al-Aqsa during Ramadan, and Hamas could be counted upon to do what it was going to do. And Netanyahu, I would assert that he counted on his own citizens, civilians dying as a result of this, as part of his political project to keep himself politically alive. That's definitionally treason, so there's that. And so we will be getting more into the depths of the specifics of this escalatory event, the origination and how it's not just this time. You can go back and watch Sharon do very, very similar things, just a generation back. And then one name or two names we might want to point out that it will be included in that and are at the almost just right, barely on the outskirts of the current legal investigations that are happening in the United States would be Michael and Barbara Ledeen, who were core to some of the interface of these projects of claiming the East Jerusalem and the Temple Mount and all of that, and how to utilize the Christian Zionist movement in the United States in order to do that, and how to utilize archaeology and all of that. So that's a future reading that we'll be doing is in relationship to that. All right, but let's go to Zionist Logic by Malcolm X. Go, Greg.
Yes, and I guess real quick, I'll make a statement, follow up what you said there real quick, and we'll be talking more about this. In the near future when we'll be doing another recording more centered around specific to the current events going on, like in the Middle East and everything. But I just follow up on what you said. I don't believe it's possible to really understand, and not to say we have all the answers either, because we don't, we're all, because none of us do. But I think it's very difficult to understand the dynamic of what's going on, particularly in this moment with the nature of what Netanyahu's up to and the current actions in the region, as well as even like the shifting in terms of like the public sentiment towards Israel, Palestine, and the U.S. And then generally taking into consideration the events of the last 5-10 years, as you're talking about, without understanding both the dynamic of like the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship, our own government, our own institutions compromised as far as like to this entity is the Israeli state, and then also this factor of Russia, China, this shifting, the important geopolitical shifts that took place under Trump and moving closer away from, which was one of the big things that Trump, as far as like moving the balance of power away from like the American, in terms of like America being this as corrupt of a broker as it's been, being any type of balance or counterbalance or keeping in line some of the worst of the ambitions of like the Zionist project under the Sharons and the Netanyahus of the world. So all of this has got to be taken into context, and that's why it's important to understand like both the role of Russia and Israel as it relates to 2016, all of the events since then, this global geopolitical shift and the current events in the region. It has to be understood in that context. And at this point, like just the traditional narrative of like, Israel Zionism and as far as like the conventional quote unquote alternative media rhetoric discourse as far as like Israel Palestine and the role of the United States, I just don't think is sufficient of anymore. It's this bigger aspect has got to be taken into consideration, really fully fleshed out as much as possible for the sake of all of us. I mean, for our own country as well as the fate of Palestinian people. So
thank you very much for that, Greg. All right. Zionist Logic by Malcolm X, taken from the Egyptian Gazette, September 17th, 1964. Quote, "The Zionist armies that now occupy Palestine claim their ancient Jewish prophets predicted that in the, quote, last days of this world, unquote, their own God would raise them up a, quote unquote, Messiah who would lead them to their promised land, and they would set up their own, quote unquote, divine government in this newly gained land. This, quote unquote, divine government would enable them to, quote, rule all other nations with a rod of iron, unquote." All right, and aside here, of course, there's all these resonances there. And this, of course, obviously, this said today by any African American or anyone really would be immediately condemned as anti-Semitic trope, right? But he's making some links that are very uncomfortable in relationship to it's become the case that the secular Zionists are trying to take the lead away from the religious Zionists because they know it's a totally untenable position in the 20th and 21st century world to say that this religious book of ours promises us this real estate. And so they try to make more of an indigenous ancient indigenous rights and political self-determination argument about that. But it's so interesting to watch Malcolm X take both of these aspects on, and in the first paragraph just basically expose the the danger and the threat and the spiritual immorality of the project itself on both fronts. And so the question of Iron Dome, the Iron Dome has gotten so much, it's been talked about a lot. It obviously got a lot of play in knocking down most of the Hamas rockets. But then there's also Jabotinsky and all of the resonance with iron. There's a lot of talk of iron in relationship to the Zionist project. So it's very interesting to watch, to read Malcolm X bring it back to the religious justification of this idea of, quote, rule all other nations with a rod of iron, unquote. Anti-Semitic trout. This is why Malcolm X was such a strong voice, and crucial in many ways. Martin Luther King Jr. was not saying any of these kinds of things. He was very quietly behind the scenes making some overtures to the Arab world and the Palestinians, and the ADL was even on to that. So this is just very interesting. All right, let's continue on. Second paragraph of Zionist Logic by Malcolm X. Quote, if the Israeli Zionists believe their present occupation of Arab Palestine is the fulfillment of predictions made by their Jewish prophets, then they also religiously believe that Israel must fulfill its quote-unquote divine mission to rule all other nations with a rod of irons, which only means a different form of iron-like rule, more firmly entrenched even than that of the former European colonial powers. These Israeli Zionists religiously believe their Jewish God has chosen them to replace the outdated European colonialism with a new form of colonialism, so well disguised that it will enable them to deceive the African masses into submitting willingly to their quote-unquote divine authority and guidance, without the African masses being aware that they are still colonized. Okay, and aside here, this is very interesting that he immediately goes to the Africa connection. And as we will see in relationship to other readings around the background of what was evolving in terms of John F. Kennedy's foreign policy, especially in relationship to Africa, and the way that it's even maligned to this day in a fairly deceptive fashion by the commanding heights of the dissident left, including people like Noam Chomsky, and the obvious facts that point to serious foreign policy being immediately changed after the assassination of John Kennedy, who, by the way, that's when Malcolm X, I believe, made his famous quote about the chickens coming home to roost. And which I think it's sort of now obvious that he was probably insinuating deeper politics behind that. But in the moment, in historical context, it's been attempted to be put in a box in relationship to, oh, look, another white American killed the white American president or something like that. But I think it could be seen that it was an insinuation that the covert operations element, and who knows, maybe there was some aspect that he had a sense of the Israeli element, the U.S. patronage of Israel, which had been a whole generation by then, was also coming directly home to roost. So that's a possibility. And we saw the NSM 263, I think it was, turn into NSM 273. So Kennedy announces that almost all American advisors will be out, and troops, I think, will be out of Vietnam within a few years. And then that's almost immediately in the wake of the assassination reversed by Johnson. And to this day, that's also lied about. But the most obvious one that is reason for the assassination of Kennedy that is suppressed is the question of the Israeli nuclear bomb, obviously. and the head of CIA counterintelligence and the head of the Israel desk, James Jesus Angleton, is the most obvious character who would play some kind of interstitial role between the interests of the elements of the U.S. deep state that were involved, and then the elements of the Israeli deep state that were involved in that. But what's not often talked about is what Malcolm X is talking about in this very first section is in relationship to Israel, and the Zionist project is about the African continent, and that Kennedy's part of Kennedy's program, or Kennedy's foreign policy in the midst of the Cold War, was actually about creating some room for a non-aligned, for a potentially independent nationalist governments in Africa to begin to emerge. And similarly to what maybe the second prime minister of Israel, Moshe Sharett, I believe he believed in, that he was against the terrorists who were amplifying that, including people like Shimon Peres, and they were carrying out they were planning for the Operation Susanna, which became the Lavon affair, the false flag attempts at bombings and firebombing of U.S. and British installations in Egypt in 54, I think that was, and including things like libraries. And by the way, the Israeli Air Force bombed the biggest and most important bookstore in Gaza. And it was also, they also bombed educational centers. They bombed the city, the street squares in order to stop people from being able to get to hospitals. So they were trying to prevent the basic civil functioning of things like journalism, education, medicine, and all of that. So there's a background here. People always talk about the Nazis burning books. Yes, but the Zionists also like to burn books.
Amazing. Amazing when you consider how, like, all these, these pro-Zionist, pro-Israel propagandists here in the West always talking about the destruction of culture and all this when that whole was taking place with what you just referred there in terms of like the destruction of Palestinian culture. And then on the note, on this line in this article about these Israeli Zionists religiously believe their Jewish God has chosen them to replace the outdated European colonialism with a new form of colonialism. This is a very interesting line because you mentioned Kennedy and the attempting to basically to move away from some of the, certainly like it seemed like much of the controlled Cold War political and geopolitical machinations that were going on multiple sides. And it seems that like what you meant with like this actual like serious like non-aligned, away from like these countries being at the fate of these global powers, both, it seems to be an attempt to like maybe get away from both the aforementioned outdated European colonialism as well as whatever this new form of like Zio imperial colonialism will be, with the combination of both the interest of like this particular Zionist project as well as like the American Western political foreign policy establishment. It's very interesting. And for future reference, for a potential future Antidote Deepcore Clubhouse, there was an article written in Covert Action magazine on January 14th of this year by James D. Eugenio, which I think has made the best case for how Kennedy administration was directly in the process of overturning a lot of very, I would say, negative foreign policy goals in multiple regions of the world. The article is titled "Destructing JFK, a coup d'état over foreign policy." So that is something that I think we may come back to in the future here. But I think that really describes a lot of the dynamics that you just talked about taking place in the Kennedy administration that likely led to the events of November 22nd, 1963, and its aftermath in terms of just taking a completely negative direction, particularly around the matter of Israel, in terms of just the way like the U.S.-Israel relationship, that dynamic completely changed after that, to the point to where obviously leading into the moment we've had now. So just wanted to bring that article.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and that was the article I was thinking of, and I think we should read that whole article. Actually, it's sort of long, but I think you're right that really feeds into understanding some of these larger dynamics of the colonial history surrounding all of this, and how there was other possibilities here. Because when I reference this question of Moshe Sharett, the second prime minister of Israel, that he saw a different path forward in relationship to how to relate to the West specifically, and of course that there was a different way of considering what would become of the Zionist project now that it was an official state and that it was on the international stage legally. So in terms of recognition and all of that he saw a possibility of appealing to the better angels of the West, and in his rivals who were even undermining him while he was in the prime minister position were all about terrorizing the West. And there's a very interesting book. We probably should read from some of it for a future Antidote Deepcore text room in Clubhouse, titled Israel's Sacred Terrorism by Olivia Rokash, a study based on Moshe Sharett's personal diary and other documents. And by the way, a foreword by Noam Chomsky. All right, Noam Chomsky. That's good. And chapter 7 is titled The Lavon Affair, Terrorism to Coerce the West. And it's basically, it goes over all of these considerations of Sharett, of that this whole crew who was doing the Lavon Affair and planning to do the fire bombings of the British and American installations in Egypt, in terms of geopolitical strategies of tension and focuses on libraries and all of that background, that he saw another pathway forward rather than coercing and terrorizing the West. And then final point here is that there is something that looks like Malcolm X is very openly saying here, that there's something different about this form of settler colonialism. And it's so interesting that this is another area where I see more and more that there's these strong limitations of the current form of leftist, the way that leftist ideologies politically practice in regards to Palestinian liberation, let's say, in the current moment, that it does not deal with this element of that this is a settler colonial project of some sort. And of course, the secular Zionists they have a better argument here. They basically say that, all right, yes, a lot of the Jews came back, back to the Holy Land from all around the world, but they are inherently indigenous, so it can't be settler colonialism because these are not really outsiders. And there's an interesting point there that I think that understanding how this is not just settler colonialism like it happened in the Americas, for example, where it was clearly an outsider, and sure, there was these tons of religious overtures and symbolic overlays in relationship to the right of the European settlers that they felt to conquer these lands and Christianize the savages and all of that. So obviously there was a religious component to it, but this specific religious component here that Malcolm X points to about this quote, the quote-unquote divine government would enable them to, quote, rule all other nations with a rod of iron, unquote. I'm not aware of that in terms of what has been, at the very least, the overt expression of settler colonialism, the classic form of European settler colonialism. Sure, in many cases it operated as such, even if it wasn't overtly regarding scripture, the right to rule all of the other nations as such. But there's something very, very specific here about the overt religious architecture of the supremacist project here, and the fact that it's complicated by the question of the return of the indigenous in relationship to this that makes understanding the global aspirations of this specific settler colonial project even more important, I would say. And that's why I think it's important to talk about Palestinification. And Palestinification, more and more, I think about it as not only the ethno-supremacist targeting of your people, wherever you may be, including the technologies of occupation, the surveillance state, the use of terrorism, the use of false flags, the suppression of political and human rights, the political speech that we're seeing more and more in an American context with the escalation of the police powers or the police training in Israel in terms of logic of occupation, psychology and logic of occupation, but also the increasingly, I would say, seditious acts from the American element side to accept the overt Israeli government's desire to begin to more and more suppress very core First Amendment rights around things like boycott, divestment, sanction, in relationship to holding basic contracts with the state governments around the country. So there's that aspect of Palestinification, but more and more I'm seeing also in relationship to the way that the Palestinians, both in Palestine on the ground, suffering these massive violence against them, but also the very strong solidarity around the world in the Palestinian diaspora and their ability to articulate themselves and organize with allies and bring in all kinds of allies, including Jewish allies, into the mix and really like just in a highly intellectual and morally dignified way is what I've seen. So that I more and more want to hold on to that. Also the aspirational aspect of the Palestinification that even we, the American people, I as a Jewish American who considers myself a patriot of conscience in both those contexts, that I take a lot of inspiration from the idea of not only recognizing the Palestinification, such as we saw a little glimpse of, Greg, when in terms of the arrests in the Kansas City Public Library in an event sponsored by Israeli partisan organizations, carried out by security forces and police officer who accepted a junket, an alleged training trip to Israel itself just months earlier, and all of that it's not just that Palestinification, but it's also the Palestinification, meaning the rise to a strength of purpose and a dignity in the midst of massive trauma and challenge and violence, to be able to persist and just be able to live one's life while also having one's facts down and knowing what's going on. And what I've learned in terms of like listening in on Palestinian rooms on Clubhouse in the last weeks and months really has just been incredible. And it's beyond just the facts that I've learned. It's also the facility with one's own and the seriousness with one's own history and political knowledge as a crucial tool that I think that I take for granted in terms of the position, our position here in the United States. And, we've talked a lot about that it's not, of course, it's not all. There's a lot of covert warfare against the American people. But in general, this question of like how crucial it is, how core it is to really know your own history and your own political purpose. I just see the plain spokenness and the clarity of the Palestinian people that I've heard talking, and it's just I just want to begin to honor that too. All right, next.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more.
Okay, thank you, Greg. All right, next section here is titled Camouflage. This is Zionist Logic by Malcolm X, published September 17th, 1964. Oh, is that Constitution Day, or is that, I think it's Constitution Day, actually, September 17th. That's interesting. All right, and maybe it's the 16th. No, I think it's the 17th. All right, we'll check that out later. All right, camouflage.
Constitution Day is September 17th.
Wow, that's pretty interesting there, Malcolm X. Go you. All right. Quote, the Israeli Zionists are convinced they have successfully camouflaged their new kind of colonialism. Their colonialism appears to be more, quote unquote, benevolent, more, quote unquote, philanthropic, a system which they rule simply by getting their potential victims to accept their friendly offers of economic, quote unquote, aid and other tempting gifts that they dangle in front of the newly independent African nations whose economies are experiencing great difficulties. Just an aside here, this is really important. He is so far ahead. I mean, what he's talking about here is still not, barely, this is not even understood in a predominant way in even like the hardcore left circles who are the strongest supporters of the Palestinians in the West, I think. And this question of philanthropic, right? Because this is actually exactly how the Jewish mob networks that were crucial to the early support of Israel, such as the Meyer Lansky network, how those networks, which would include Leslie Wexner and significant elements of the mega group, which were the commanding heights of Zionist power in terms of a small group of Jewish Zionist billionaires in North America, that a lot of them were basically had washed their reputations in philanthropy over and over. Mo Dalitz, the whole background of this whole ADL network, how the ADL is not only used as an Israeli partisan organization, it's also used as a reputation washing organization for the organized crime syndicate, then the Jewish mob, and turns it into awards for fighting anti-Semitism or something like that. But more and more, you see that there's a washing here. You see the names of the mega group members on the outside of buildings of medical facilities on university campuses and other such quote unquote philanthropic endeavors across the United States, for example. And so Malcolm X is extending this understanding to basically the way that Israel is going to be approaching the entirety of the continent of Africa and some of its newly independent nations. And we should point out that this kind of understanding is crucial right now, especially after the quote unquote ceasefire and what happens after, what's the nature of the so-called normalization, quote unquote peace deal of the Trump-Kushner in relationship to Netanyahu and the Arab neighbors, and in the conjunction with the apparent abandonment of the Palestinian cause. At the root of that is a carrot operation of the technology, of the extension of the Israeli great technology to all of these countries.
Yeah, what you mentioned, the benevolence and the philanthropy and the offers of economic aid. I mean, that was a big part of it. We talked about it when the details of like the Trump Kushner quote unquote peace deal came out, and basically it seemed like it was going to be a trade off of like this some levels of like economic security and technology being brought to the Palestinians in exchange for basically giving up on their namesake and giving up on their heritage and giving up on their land, and as their former allies in the region have also sold them out basically in terms of like the Gulf countries and kingdoms, etc. And so that was an example of that. I mention this more as we get into this paragraph here, but we did a program for the Antidote a while back where we covered an interview titled "How the Talpia Program Works," and we detailed an interview of Benjamin Netanyahu talking to Mark Levin on Fox News, where Netanyahu's basically almost laying out like this based on, I think it's around time when Netanyahu made another speech at I forget what forum it was, what was in, where he basically laid out like this carrot and stick approach for developing countries, like get them on the side of Israel. And this is also important in terms of like the burgeoning Israeli relationships with Russia and China, and the inroads that particularly China is making into Africa, being put out there, especially in certain circles here in the West, as like as the alternative to like the corrupt Western system of in terms of control over the rest of the world. And so that's dynamic to watch in the near future. I think it does figure into this what was being laid out in 1964 in the current moment in terms of these burgeoning relationships with China and Russia, and this global geopolitical dynamic in terms of this approach of the more benevolent foreign power is going to come in and clean up the mess that like the American imperialists have been making for all these decades.
Thank you, Greg. And I think what you're referring to in terms of that speech that Netanyahu laid this out in, I think it was AIPAC 2018, March of 2018, when he talked.
I know the Levin interview on Fox was right around that time on his program. So yeah.
Yeah, and so we should link to that both our antidote video, how the Talpiot program works, but also the video of Netanyahu's speech, because he lays this out completely. He talks about how we're painting the map blue. I'm going to everywhere in the world. Everywhere wants our technology. Africa wants our technology. Asia wants our technology. Even the Muslim countries want our technology. Everyone but Iran and North Korea, or something like that. It's sort of the way that he talks about it as the Israeli technology, both security and beyond, and counterterrorism and all of that, is a carrot that is being offered to the entirety of the world in relationship to that. But then, of course, right behind that is the logic of the iron rod, the Zionist stick, which is basically what we might call the kill switch diplomacy question of, once you accept Israeli cyber into your core communications network, critical infrastructure, then you have what can be utilized as a kill switch. So if you don't accept or if you bite the hand that feeds you in terms of the technology carrot, and Netanyahu described this specifically about how this strategy of his was going to take effect at the UN General Assembly. He said they haven't got the message yet, but they will. And so the carrot of the upside of the civilian technology is backed up by the stick of the kill switch, Unit 8200 Talpiot program driven, embedded, technology in critical infrastructure around the world of any country that accepts it, where if you're basically then under compromat, right? So it's the same thing with this Epstein-Maxwell Israeli military intelligence run, much more micro compromat network, where the videos are not ever deployed really. They probably never had to deploy them. Bill Clinton, just sort of knew they were there. He enjoyed the carrots of the girls presented to him, by Epstein. And, but the sticks of the video compromat of proven pedophilia, illegal, highly criminal, actions was always there behind the scenes. I think it's similar in terms of this much more macro geopolitical situation too that Netanyahu was directly referring to at his speech at AIPAC 2018. All right, let's keep going on here. We are reading from Zionist Logic by Malcolm X, taken from the Egyptian Gazette, published Constitution Day, September 17th, 1964. All right, I'm gonna read this paragraph again, and I will work not to interrupt the flow of the text here, Greg. I'm sorry. Okay. Quote, camouflage. The Israeli Zionists are convinced that they have successfully camouflaged their new kind of colonialism. Their colonialism appears to be more quote-unquote benevolent, more quote-unquote philanthropic, a system with which they rule simply by getting their potential victims to accept their friendly offers of economic quote-unquote aid and other tempting gifts that they dangle in front of the newly independent African nations, whose economies are experiencing great difficulties. During the 19th century, when the masses here in Africa were largely illiterate, it was easy for European imperialists to rule them with, quote, force and fear, unquote. But in this present era of enlightenment, the African masses are awakening, and it is impossible to hold them in check now with the antiquated methods of the 19th century. The imperialists, therefore, have been compelled to devise new methods. Since they can no longer force or frighten the masses into submission, they must devise modern methods that will enable them to maneuver the African masses into willing submission. The modern 20th century weapon of neo-imperialism is, quote, dollarism, unquote. The Zionists have mastered the science of dollarism. Wah, 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 anti-Semitic tropes, anti-Semitic tropes.
It's only okay when when Benjamin Netanyahu's son does that with George Soros.
Exactly, right, and who led the anti-Semitic tropes operation against George Soros? Arthur Finkelstein's Finky Kids Networks, yes. Right?
Yep. They can take the very real criticisms, some real criticisms of like the role of George Soros, and completely weaponizing them and exaggerating them out of proportion.
And of course the Arthur Finkelstein Network was fully in the mix, especially in relationship to the George Soros anti-Semitic trope operation in Hungary with Viktor Orban, and of course, as we pointed out many times before, that Israeli military intelligence operative and Hollywood producer extraordinaire Arnon Milchan, the producer of the movie by Oliver Stone, by the way, interviewer of Putin for HBO or whatever those interviews were on, which Zionist network they were played on, that Arnon Milchan produced the movie on the conspiracy behind the assassination.
I believe that Putin Showtime. I believe it was
Showtime.
Okay. It was Putin Oliver Stone interviews, and also Oliver Stone's history of the untold history of the United States was broadcast either on HBO or Showtime as well. So that's all interesting, but.
Good points. All right. So Arnon Milchan produces JFK, the film, that very conveniently it leaves out the direct questions about the relationship of the Kennedy relationship to Israel, which would include both John's relationship to Ben-Gurion and John attempting to prevent an outbreak of nuclear arms in the Middle East by preventing the development of nukes by Israel. And this was also not, Kennedy still promised Israel protection still under the American umbrella during the Cold War. He just was not thought it would destabilize the region, and so that's very interesting. That a key Israeli military and intelligence agent, Arnon Milchan, who was directly responsible for trucking and bartering illegally, by the way, it looks like in nuclear triggers, for example, from Southern California and other places, was the producer of the film that explained all of the conspiracy reasons behind the assassination of the president. But also Robert Kennedy, who was also, it looks like he was assassinated. Actually, the Robert Kennedy assassination it has much more direct Zionist fingerprints even than the John Kennedy assassination, of which the Zionist fingerprints on that are replete. But the Robert Kennedy one is even more so. And Robert Kennedy was not only running for president, but he had also, as Attorney General under his brother, they were working together to force the then fairly nascent Israel lobby, then known as AZEC, and that became AIPAC, to be just basically registered as an agent of FARA, basically Foreign Agent Registration Act type stuff. Very basic things that are beginning to come back into the fold in the midst of this exact same network, this Netanyahu, Putin, Trump network, and all of those operatives. And so that it's very, very interesting. And just one last thing I want to point out about someone like Milchan is that Milchan was not only a procurer of nuclear materials, nuclear triggers and technologies, but in his biography titled Confidential, which we should read some from in a future Antidote Deepcore text room on Clubhouse, it points out very specifically that his role as he was under LACOM, it looks like LACOM, it was formulated. It was mainly started or cultivated over the mid 20th century years by Shimon Peres, the future prime minister of Israel, who is in many ways the political godfather of the Israeli nuclear program. That it was known as the Bureau of Scientific Liaisons or Scientific Relations, LACOM. And so Arnon Milchan was an agent or an agent of LACOM. But LACOM was not only about actually nuclear materials, nuclear triggers, but it was also about information. For example, Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, looks like he was also potentially involved in a LACOM-style operation in terms of the materials that he would procure for Israel, which would include things like software, right? The Promise software. And then the backdooring of that then gets reintroduced into a U.S. weapons labs, nuclear weapons labs, Sandia, maybe both Sandia and Los Alamos. John Key, U.S. Senator John Tower is the key cutout agent that helps Maxwell then bring back the material, the software material in this case that he procured for Israel, that had been then backdoor Trojan horse and then reinserted back into highest levels of U.S. nuclear weapons programs. And we covered then how it looks like Chinese intelligence worked with Israeli intelligence to enter in and then steal the nuclear codes, basically, of the nuclear bomb squad in the DOE NEST, N-E-S-T, that conveniently was out of the country for the first time in 3 years on September 11th, so they could not make an appearance at ground zero and all the indicators there. But also the Chinese intelligence and Israeli intelligence apparently stole the hard drives, took the information of the hard drives that NEST would use to diffuse such things as micronuclear devices, terrorist tactical nukes, which, by the way, the reason that the NEST was out of the country for the first time in 3 years on September 11th, they were in Europe, in a European theater, was in a drill of undoing a terrorist nuclear device in the European theater. And then Southern Manhattan becomes ground zero. So I'm just pointing that out now. And then finally, this question of LACOM and Arnon Milchan, it was not just nuclear devices or nuclear materials or nuclear triggers, and it was not just software or other type of informational materials that Robert Maxwell was a master of procuring for Israel. Remember, he also was a publisher, not only of newspapers, but of textbooks. He apparently was able to procure very high-level scientific textbooks and journals and articles, and some of them maybe even, I think, classified from aspects of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and deliver all of those into Israel. But Milchan, and this is said directly in the book Confidential about his life, was also responsible for, he was told exactly what of the entirety of the Israeli weapons laboratories and weapons programs were lacking, including in biological and chemical weapons. And so there's a future program to be dealt with in terms of the question of the opioid crisis, Teva Pharmaceuticals, the anthrax attack, the nanosilicate particles that were used in order to attack the U.S. senators in the wake of September 11th in the midst of the question about the Patriot Act, all of those kinds of things. And then the question of COVID and long-term Lieutenant Colonel Danny Shoham, 20-year veteran of the Israeli biological warfare program, was the first guy, I think, to point the finger at just a Chinese lab as the origin of COVID.
Almost immediately parroted by the Steve Bannon, Frank Gaffney Committee for the Present Danger China crowd, as well as, I believe, right away, Senator Tom Cotton. But it was Danny Shoham in the, of course, the page of the Washington Times, which is the preeminent publication of the Council for National Policy, where that report originated. You're correct.
All right, thank you, Greg. All right, let's take it back to the text. All right, so next we were on to dollarism. All right, we're reading from Zionist Logic by Malcolm X, taken from the Egyptian Gazette, published September 17, 1964, under the section Camouflage. Quote, "The Zionists have mastered the science of dollarism, the ability to come posing as a friend and benefactor, bearing gifts and all other forms of economic aid and offers of technical assistance. Thus, the power and influence of Zionist Israel in many of the newly quote-unquote independent African nations has fast become even more unshakable than that of the 18th century European colonialists. And this new kind of Zionist colonialism differs only in form and method, but never in motive or objective. At the close of the 19th century, when European imperialists wisely foresaw that the awakening masses of Africa would not submit to their old method of ruling through force and fears, these ever-scheming imperialists had to create a, quote, new weapon, unquote, and to find a, quote, new base, unquote, for that weapon. All right, interesting. This is the kind of like deep critical left style analysis that the current leftists should read. where it deals with the old imperialists, the European colonialists, and obviously the American role in all of this. But it's not just that. There's something else also going on here, and something new going on here. Okay.
Yes, and it relates, as we talked about above, as specifically I think relates to the current moment that is being laid out here in 1964 as it applies 57 years after the writing of this, is that this current moment, I believe, of this new imperialism, a big part of it is this other factor that we mentioned before that's going on in terms of like Israel and this burgeoning relationship with entities such as Russia and China being enabled ultimately by this MAGA Trump ultimate geopolitical battering ram against like any type of American, serious American power influence in the world is, it seems, you could make it seems like case could be made that this new imperialism is going to come under that in the name of replacing like the old American global order, or whatever you want to call it, in the legacy of like the old, what is known as the old European imperialism that many people think Netanyahu falsely believe, like a Benjamin Netanyahu still represents. So
good point. The next turning of the colonial wheel, you might say, in many ways. And I would just point out too, in terms of we've more and more looked into some of these questions of Israeli relationship with Central America and some of the dictatorships and their supplying of key technology, including surveillance technology, to governments like Rios Montt in Guatemala. And now we found that there was a connection between this sort of pseudo messianic Temple Mount provocateur destruction group to a Christian Zionist group in America that was directly connected to Rios Montt. And so we're also very interested in the connection to Africa. just pointing out that this question of nuclear programs and biological programs, it's very interesting that just recently Human Rights Watch declares, after a long, very serious study, and I think it's a 200-something page PDF report, and very well argued, that Israel is in total an apartheid regime, an apartheid country. And of course, that's just the basics of it. And Palestinians have been making this point for decades, really, of course. But that Israel is not only, an apartheid country, but it also worked with apartheid South Africa directly. And that was one of its most serious bases, strategic allies, bases in the African continent, in relationship to the Vela incident. I think is one of the ones that suggests that the South Africans and the Israelis were actually testing nuclear weapons. That was off the coast of South Africa, and it was found to have a signature of some type of a nuclear device. But also biological weapons, ethno-specific biological weapons that South African apartheid government was working with Israelis in terms of those. I mean, there's some very disturbing, interesting stuff in what's that book? The one by Tom Mangold, the same guy who wrote one of the shakier books on Angleton, I'd say, but his book on Plague Wars, I think that's what it's called. Yeah, Plague Wars by Tom Mangold. At the very end of it, it has a few paragraphs about the South Africa and Israel and ethno-specific bioweapons, and how far along the Israelis had come in terms of very specifically parsing out the genetics of how close they could come to targeted bioweapons in relationship to the Arab world, Palestine, Iraq, parsing out certain Jewish genetics. And so there is a serious relationship there. And then finally, they also work together, apartheid South Africa and Israel, in the United States via the so-called Anti-Defamation League, of course, and the spy scandal run through the California offices of the Anti-Defamation League, specifically in Los Angeles, was where it looked to have been managed. But then the intelligence was pilfered out of the San Francisco, I think, police offices by a police agent who was also a U.S. intelligence agent who was working on behalf via the ADL as a cutout for delivering information on Americans, and specifically Palestinian solidarity activists, Palestinians themselves, but also anti-apartheid activists in relationship to South Africa. And that was done via the ADL, and it was Israeli intelligence in conjunction with South African intelligence spying on Americans. And Palestinian activists even got killed in it looks like it was probably, I don't think it's ever been proven, but the architecture of it looks like a JDL, a Jewish Defense League firebomb attack. I think it was in Orange County somewhere. So I don't know if that was a direct outgrowth in a similar way that the Pegasus cyber weapon software designed by Israeli military intelligence firm NSO Group, the aforementioned NSO Group that is represented by the former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who said he could land the plane in relationship to the Trump-Russia investigation. More and more, land the plane means maybe not only help save Trump's treasonous ass legally, but also, for the moment at least, in terms of that investigation, but mainly, I think, in relationship to putting a cloak over or tamping down the question of the Netanyahu Israeli role in the 2016 Trump operation, in conjunction with others, which would include the broker of the apparent ceasefire, El Sisi, too. not only Putin, not only the UAE, MBZ and Saudi, MBS. So that, the NSO group was, created the targeting weapon for what looks like it was then used by the Saudis to target Jamal Khashoggi for eventual assassination. So that's what pops up in my mind in terms of the ADL spy scandal of the 90s, of South African apartheid intelligence and Israeli intelligence, and then things go boom and people die after that. And there's not, a direct proof of it, but that's the architecture of that kind of thing. And then the most obvious contemporary implication is that what really helped take down apartheid South Africa from the international, not the domestic, but the international perspective was divestment movement, and boycott, divestment, sanction, right? And it's eventually it has to end up with sanctioning, right? That's why Netanyahu at 2018 AIPAC with the Zionist carrot of the Unit 8200 technology that he's spreading all over the world is then backed up by the kill switch stick iron, the cyber iron rod in relationship especially to the General Assembly and the threat of potential sanction against the Israeli state that is led to eventually by boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And so the Israelis have a long, very deep and educated experience in relationship to the dangers and the threats of boycott and how that can escalate to divestment and sanctioning by having worked with the apartheid South African regime in the midst of when it was sort of beginning to head into its last legs, taken down, and from this international perspective by that exact movement, which is why the Israeli state and the Ministry of Strategic Affairs is so serious and open about the sponsorship of what, from an American perspective, is the seditious anti-BDS state level laws that are attempt to suppress very core First Amendment protected political speech in relationship to the burgeoning boycott, divestment, sanction movement. And so my one suggestion here for the Palestinians and the Palestinian solidarity movement, both on the ground in Palestine but also worldwide, is to escalate it to the level of national security and to point out the question of the Zionist iron rod in the cyber age as the danger of kill switch and the question of technology transfer. And I would just one more time repeat what that very, very convincing and plainly spoken Palestinian woman said this week on Clubhouse. We all know that Israel is Russia's Silicon Valley in the Middle East. Okay, so why does it make any sense for the United States and the NSA to be outsourcing post 9/11 the back doors for the surveillance of the American people to a country that the plain speaking Palestinians know is basically the Russian Silicon Valley of the Middle East? All right, so that's where I think this wants to go. This is where this should be escalated to in terms of our contemporary moment around boycott, divestment, sanctions. Is not just the hearts have already been won by the Palestinians. I believe they haven't won all the hearts, but they won the war for hearts. And I think this current escalation sealed the deal on that. The next step is to win the minds worldwide, win that battle. And in order to do that, it's going to have to escalate beyond just the moral outrage and the desire to protect the other, but also then to speak to enlightened self-interest, especially in the West, around the dangers of the technology of occupation, the Palestinification of our technology by the Israeli security services, and how that's been backdoored to such nemesis as Russia.
You're so correct that the hearts have been won. I think, the public tide of opinion. I mean, I think I think it has shifted to a very big level over the last several years. And I mean, now the aging Christian Zionist boomer crowd that watches, Fox News and whatever other conservative media sources. I mean, they're really not the majority anymore. And I mean, still some younger, of course, like, you do, but I mean, by and large, I think like the hearts and minds, and this is one of the things I think that really like I think this is one of the things that like people like Netanyahu are really fearful of, is they understand like the shifting and the changing as far as like in the West and all this. That's why like as amenable and as unfortunately complicit as the U.S. and the European Union and the West in general has been in terms of like the overall Israeli agenda in general. I mean, like these countries, as they're becoming more and more shifting into the direction, and the tide is shifting. And now that shift has taken place, it's time for like the taboos. I think gone are the days in which simply criticizing Israel is just considered, anti-Jewish, or that it's where it's akin to, the hatred of Jewish people or whatever. I think those days are pretty much gone. And I think now it's time, I think, for responsible people who can understand this dynamic that's going on to explain it as thoroughly and as honestly as possible. I mean, things that are kind of obvious out there, such as like around these topics, combination of like the power of Zionism in our country, as well as this international geopolitical trajectory, as you laid out, with things like the question being asked about it being raised, or the point being raised about Israel basically being Russia's Silicon Valley and all this, and the implications that has for the entire world. And so at this point, like, it is time, I think, to just move away from like just the simply like the moral argument of like the representation of like the fact that there is this oppression going on in the plight of the Palestinian people, and moving on from that, because I don't think that true freedom will ever actually come without like the whole truth being spoken as much as possible. And this is a moment to do that when the tide of public opinion has shifted, and I think people are ready for things that people by and large may not have been ready to hear just a few years ago. So.
Good point. And I will just point out that it is very likely that the greatest political ally of Palestinian liberation in the West at this point has been, over a long period of time, in large part, the left. And what you're going to find out, I believe, is it's when we begin to get into these more domestic, enlightened self-interest areas in order to further the solidarity with the Palestinian people and Palestinian liberation, but also aligned with liberation of we the people worldwide in many ways, and not just from Zionist power, but other aspects of rising authoritarianism and elements like that. But especially in the United States, Zionist power. That's where we're gonna have to take that on and figure it out. And my sense is that's when it's going to become a little bit stickier in relationship to especially some of the left aspects that are not necessarily of total good faith, in terms of they're not exactly clear about who they represent in total.
And what you just mentioned there, it's very important for like serious like American voices that understand like the dynamics of the Israel-Palestine conflict to maybe step in and ensure that these elements you just deferred do not have like this monopoly over this conversation of all things related to Israel-Palestine. So that's another topic for another time, but that is something that I think does need to be brought in there, is the importance of like actual American voices of conscience and of that have an understanding of like this conflict, to really take the high ground and make it in steering the conversation, perhaps in more closer to directions that it needs to go in.
I agree. And as a Jewish American and as a Jewish American patriot of conscience, I feel both of these aspects of responsibility and opportunity, I would say, as an American, but also as a Jew, and sort of to take on some of these intellectual battles in both of these domains. It feels like responsibility and possibility to me. And then politically, in terms of the United States, that's why I think it's so important to begin to really flesh out the radical middle of politics. And so that it's going to be so simple if it gets stuck with the left ideology. You know, it's important, you know, obviously the left has been the longest term ally, I think, to the Palestinian people in the West. And so there's obviously an important role that the left will continue to play. But I think we should anchor it in the radical middle. And the radical middle will go, not only be in the middle, but it'll go even more radical, meaning deeper, more to the root, more willing to root out things such as not just war crimes over there, but also treason over here in a way that they're connected. And that's part of, I think, the approach to problems that I think can be solved best if anchored from the radical middle and not from the wings of the American polity. All right, back to Zionist logic, Malcolm X on Zionism, unless you got a thought right now, Greg.
Oh, no, I was just saying, yeah, that's very important. The concept of like where, like, you know, instead of hanging on the wings or maybe what people might call the fringes, fairly or unfairly, of politics, like areas where like people can see eye to eye on things, and that's still possible, even with all the damage that, like, you know, the last several years has done in terms of like further dividing and inflaming people. There's still those areas. There's still basic areas where humans can, I believe, come together on. That still rings true to this.
Yes, and it'll be held together in many ways by the middle. And so in addition to international senses of law and morality, we are then going to have to add in we'll have the opportunity to add in the questions of national security and also economic sovereignty. And abundance, which will begin to play into this too. And I think that's Malcolm X's pointing out that as Africa begins to develop, it becomes a potential mark for this next generation of colonialism that comes in the form of a gift of development, of philanthropy, or that kind of thing. And so that's going to be important, I think, also in terms of anchoring an approach to this. It will have to be related to a combination in the middle of national security and economic interests, in addition to the question of law and morality. All right. Malcolm X, Zionist Logic, taken from the Egyptian Gazette, September 17th, 1964. Dollarism. This section is called Dollarism. Quote, the number one weapon of 20th century imperialism is Zionist dollarism, and one of the main bases for this weapon is Zionist Israel. The ever-scheming European imperialists wisely placed Israel where she could geographically divide the Arab world, infiltrate and sow the seed of dissension among African leaders, and also divide the Africans against the Asians. Zionist Israel's occupation of Arab Palestine has forced the Arab world to waste billions of precious dollars on armaments, making it impossible for these newly independent Arab nations to concentrate on strengthening the economies of their countries and elevate the living standard of their people. And the continued low standard of living in the Arab world has been skillfully used by the Zionist propagandists to make it appear to the Africans that the Arab leaders are not intellectually or technically qualified to lift the living standard of their people, thus indirectly, quote-unquote, inducing Africans to turn away from the Arabs and towards the Israelis for teachers and technical assistance. Quote, they cripple the bird's wing and then condemn it for not flying as fast as they, unquote. The imperialists always make themselves look good, but it is only because they are competing against economically crippled, newly independent countries whose economies are actually crippled by the Zionist capitalist conspiracy. They can't stand against fair competition. Thus, they dread Gamal Abdul Nasser's call for African-Arab unity under socialism. End of that section. And I want to point out that I think that this question of the divide and conquer aspect of the placement of Israel in relationship to, certain aspects of the European commanding heights, the city of London, that intersection, of course, of the Rothschilds and the European royalty and oligarchy and all of that, I think is crucial too in terms of beginning how there can be who in even the Israeli context, and definitely in the larger Jewish and potentially even Zionist context, can be spoken to and can be shown how that if what they truly desire is the possibility to access the ancient Jewish homelands and the potential for a true site, locus of Jewish Renaissance in all its fronts, including religious, but also culturally, intellectually, developmentally, and synergistically in terms of the diaspora being able to come back together. That is a possibility of an architecture that could, this idea of divide and conquer as the common enemy. And that would include also the Palestinian people, their corrupt leadership, the surrounding Arab countries, some of their corrupt leadership, and that if we actually create a we the people approach to this in an economic fashion. And I guess my main disagreement here with Malcolm X is that I feel he's stuck in he's still stuck in the tools of the European imperialist masters. So that's what I've talked about over and over. Like if you want to have a pragmatic economic approach for indigenous economics, we the people economics, why does it always have to be some European guy from the 1800s or something like that, whether it's capitalism or communism / socialism? No, there's other possibilities. This is why I again appeal to the radical middle. It takes a lot more work in certain ways to begin to not just rest upon terminology or ideologies that claim to have a monopoly on the possibilities beyond what Malcolm X calls the capitalist imperialist conspiracy. All right, fine. That's an interesting interpretation. But then what may lie beyond that? Is it just quote unquote socialism? Is that the answer, or is there something even beyond that, or even deeper that is from an American context? That's what I always point to. Is like these interesting documents that we can point to from an American context, including Thomas Paine, agrarian justice from the 1700s, but also people like Henry George in geoeconomics and a truly deep understanding of land-based economics that's not stuck in socialism and sort of the only entity that can control wealth is a nationalized or socialized national government. But there's something even deeper than that in terms of the question of the natural rights of the people to the commons. So that's a whole nother discussion. And, this is 1964. So I totally forgive Malcolm X in terms of resting on that terminology of the day. All right. Final section here. Messiah ? If the quote-unquote religious claim of the Zionists is true, that they were to be led to the promised land by their Messiah, and Israel's present occupation of Arab Palestine is the fulfillment of that prophecy, where is their Messiah whom their prophets said would get the credit for leading them there? It was Ralph Bunche who quote-unquote negotiated the Zionists into possession of occupied Palestine. Is Ralph Bunche the Messiah of Zionism? If Ralph Bunche is not their Messiah, and their Messiah has not yet come, then what are they doing in Palestine ahead of their Messiah? Did the Zionists have the legal or moral right to invade Arab Palestine, uproot its Arab citizens from their homes, and seize all Arab property for themselves just based on the quote-unquote religious claim that their forefathers lived there thousands of years ago? Only 1,000 years ago, the Moors lived in Spain. Would this give the Moors of today the legal and moral right to invade the Iberian Peninsula, drive out its Spanish citizens, and then set up a new Moroccan nation where Spain used to be, as the European Zionists have done to our Arab brothers and sisters in Palestine? In short, the Zionist argument to justify Israel's present occupation of Arab Palestine has no intelligent or legal basis in history, not even in their own religion. Where is their Messiah? Question mark. Unquote. That's the end of the article. And what an article it is. It is just so trenchant. It covers so many bases. And the one thing I want to say about this final question about the Messiah, where is the Messiah? And I think this then begins to link up the question of the potential good faith aspects of both the Zionist project historically, but also supporters globally, and then elements of the Israeli society, Jewish specifically, how those good faith elements can be called out of what I would say is that the Messiah has been swapped out for an idol of terrorist state and global power. Really, that's what it is, and it's based on ethno-religious supremacism and ongoing ethnic cleansing and occupation, and based upon its maintenance in the commanding heights around the world, and most especially in the United States and the West, by the terror and the terrorizing, the frightening of the populations, at the very least, of the West, into supporting that idolatrous terrorist state and global power project. But meanwhile, the desire to have a homeland, a Palestinian homeland, where Palestinians were home not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, but now carry the keys that their parents or grandparents left the home with, never to be able to return, and continue to face the Nakba and the expulsion. And may it be that the Jewish experience of Shoah, of suffering, in its different contexts and its different motivations, and as we the Jewish people, let's say, not continue. Let's do the work. Let's do the psychological, the psycho-spiritual work, even, I would say, in combination of looking within, both collectively, i.e., what the heck is going on with the so-called leadership, both in the Jewish state, but also worldwide, in terms of the commanding heights of Jewish power and all the institutions that are dominated in relationship to nepotistic networks of Jewish power that pervasively support the idolatrous terrorist state apparatus. In looking both within the collective and inside our own individual minds, hearts, and souls, that there may be that what I would associate with the prophetic Jewish tradition, and how to solve the ongoing moral outrage and spiritual and physical crimes against the Palestinian people, most directly, of what has been made of the Zionist project. And that the Messiah is potentially, in a prophetic, in a very wide and macro view, the Messiah will rise within the hearts, and will rise from within, will emanate from within. It's not going to be some guy. It's an age of reckoning, and it's an age of moral outrage that then gets folded out into wise and courageous action towards that will heal that that violent, apparent and manufactured in many ways and tortured divide between the quote unquote self and the other in this context, the Jew and the Palestinian in this context in certain ways. And there's so many possibilities where the politics and the state apparatus stuff, there's so many possibilities. That's not the problem. The problem is the moral will and the spiritual vision, and then the willingness to speak the truth, and then to take the steps of action towards getting it done. And getting it done will result in something where all people's rights will inherently be respected. And it's not, don't worry, it's not going to be driving the Jews into the sea. And no, it's not going to be finally, cleansing the Palestinians finally from Greater Israel, or, rebuilding the temple in that kind of context by destroying something else. No, if it's anything is going to happen, and if it's going to work out, then what it will begin to look like is it will look like a locus, a very almost like an indigenous locus of religious and spiritual and cultural and technological, and I would say maybe even political ferment of where the mixing of or the interface, not necessarily the mixing, but the interface, the diverse interface of different approaches, where, especially in the religions of the book, Jews, Christians, and Muslims in that context, with, of course, the openness for the secular, the agnostic, the those that don't believe in God, but that might focus on the possibility of the best of the traditions of the books of the West, in terms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that there might be an incredible future there. But it's not going to exist under a gangster terrorist state. And I believe that the Zionists of bad faith are finally starting to realize that they're losing the info war. That's what I got a sense of finally this week. And so all right, so I guess that's my thoughts on it. And I appreciate this article a lot by Malcolm X, and it's so prescient and so ahead of its time. And so thank you so much, Greg, for doing this with me.
Thank you. And I think your last point was very important, because, the people behind this project, as far as like the purveyors of the worst of the policies that we're seeing play out, they inherently understand like that. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of like losing the minds of the people. Like, they inherently know that they're not going to be able to control the narratives and the way people react to these things forever, which of course is a big part of the reason I was talking about before of some of the measures that are being taken in Western countries in recent years, and the shift in terms of what we've seen with the rise of the Trumps of the world, etc. And so that's why I'm with you. I go back and reiterate the point of the being more forceful, being more adamant, and being more willing to go in the direction of the serious topics that need to be discussed with regards to all this, that are crucial for all of us. I mean, here in the West and in the Middle East alike. And so this is a moment, sometimes like it's hard to be optimistic when you look at the world and the way things are, and there's so many reasons to be. But, there is this silver lining. It's like, you don't want to even make it sound like, there's silver linings to, dozens of children being killed, basically a massive war crime being carried out. But I mean, in addition to what we talked about, some of the other things going on with the destruction of culture and the other effects of the events of the past 2 weeks, as well as the effects that are going to be had in the future as all this. But I mean, there's an opportunity for people as far as like to begin to shift it, to really begin to make headway in shifting the conversation to areas of prominence that has never really been, where it has never really been before, at a level of prominence. And it may not seem like a big deal, but even with like the way some of the media is covering Israel Palestine, there are ample opportunities there for like the conversation to really shift. And so that's for people to really, that's up to people like us to do that collectively. So.
Well, thank you for those points, Greg. And I agree that it's not a time to, while Gaza is still devastated and while people in Palestine and some in Israel too are mourning their dead, that it's not a time to celebrate the possibility that is created. That's obviously not the case. But your deeper point here is so crucial. And I would just point out finally that is the deeper meaning of the question of a martyr. And I would urge my Jewish brethren and sistren, and that would include those in Israel who will unconsciously take up the idea of the martyr, but potentially not digest it properly and put it into, let's, get revenge and take out more mass violence on Palestinians and apartment buildings and all of that. But that that also that the Palestinians, when they use the word, that the deepest aspect of the word martyr is not that person signed up to die for the cause, but it's an urging to not let their death be in vain. And so it's on us, the living, to make sure that their life and death is not in vain. And that includes by not abusing their death for just a crude and brute, a revanchist desire for revenge, but to have it be that it was not, that their life was not lost in vain, that something worthwhile and something beautiful was made to emerge because we did not forget them, and we did not forget how it came to be that they were unjustly killed. And so that, I think, is what then lies to us, as you pointed out so correctly, Greg. It's up to us now, the living, to steward this ship through the troubled waters. All right. This is Jeremy Roth-Gushel and Greg McCarran here with the Antidote, specifically Antidote Deepcore texts, having read Zionist Logic by Malcolm X. All right. Until next time.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.